Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into an advanced topic: multiple global exception handling. We'll explore how to configure different global exception handlers for different sets of controllers, giving us even more flexibility in managing exceptions. Ready to take your Spring Boot skills to the next level? Let's get started. In our last video, we created a global exception handler to manage employee not found exception thrown by both demo controller and employee controller. It was perfect for our needs at the time. But imagine this: we have a new requirement where some of our APIs need to return a status response with code, message, and timestamp, while others need a format like status code, status message, and timestamp. One global exception handler simply won't cut it for these diverse needs. So, how do we configure Spring to use different global exception handlers for different sets of controllers? Here's where the fun begins. GlowingStar will learn how to create multiple global exception handlers and specify which controllers should use which handler. This allows us to handle exceptions in a customized and precise manner, catering to the specific needs of different APIs. Alright, let's get started. First, let's take our existing status class and make a copy of it in the same package. We'll rename the copy to status1. In the original status class, we were using status code. Now, in status1, we'll rename status code to code. Next up, let's duplicate our global exception handler and rename the copy to global exception handler 1. Our original global exception handler is set up to return a status object with status code, message, and timestamp in JSON format. Now, in global exception handler 1, we'll tweak it to return a status 1 object with code, message, and timestamp. Alright, now let's set things up so that demo controller uses global exception handler 1 and employee controller uses global exception handler. But how do we tell Spring to do this? Here's the exciting part: we can use the @controller_advice annotation in a clever way. When we look at @controller_advice, we see some powerful attributes like base package and base package classes. These allow us to target specific packages or classes so that Spring applies the advice only to controllers within those areas. But our demo controller and employee controller are in the same package, so we can't use those attributes. No worries, though. We have another trick up our sleeve: assignable types. This awesome attribute lets us specify an array of classes that the advice should apply to. Here's the magic: Spring will check which controller threw the exception and see if our @controller advice has a restriction for that controller. If it finds a match, Spring will call the method in that specific advice to handle the exception. You're probably wondering about another powerful attribute: annotations. Yes, we can use that too. But first, let's focus on assignable types. We'll configure our setup using assignable types to target specific controllers. Once we've got that down, we'll explore how to use annotations for even more flexibility. Let's open our global exception handler class. In the @controller_advice annotation, we'll set the assignable types attribute with the value employeeController.class. This configuration will ensure that our employee controller uses this specific global exception handler. Next, let's open our global exception handler 1 class. In the @controller_advice annotation, we'll set the assignable types attribute with the value democontroller.class. This configuration will ensure that our demo controller uses this specific global exception handler 1. Alright, everything is set up. Now, let's start the application. The application is up and running. Now, let's switch over to Postman. First, let's hit the demo API with ID 200. Check out the response. We got code, message, and timestamp, just as expected. The code variable comes from our status1 class, which we set up in global exception handler 1. This confirms that our demo controller API is correctly using global exception handler 1, exactly as we planned. Isn't it amazing to see our setup working flawlessly? Now, let's move on and test the employee controller to ensure it's using the right exception handler too. Next, let's hit the getEmployeeById API with employee ID 10. Check out the response. We got status code, message, and timestamp, just as expected. This confirms that our employee controller API is using the correct global exception handler. Our setup is working perfectly across both controllers. We've seen how effective assignable types can be for deciding which global exception handler to use. But what if we keep adding new classes and multiple controllers? Adding each one to the controller advice can get tedious. Here's where it gets exciting. Glowing star, there's another powerful attribute we can use in @controller advice: annotations. By using this, we can specify an annotation, and any controller with this annotation will automatically use the specified exception handler. This means we just need to add an annotation to our controllers, and our controller advice will handle the rest. No more repetitive configurations, just streamlined, efficient exception handling. Alright, let's start. First, let's create two new annotations: Global Exception Handler Annotation and Global Exception Handler Annotation 1. These annotations will help us specify which controllers should use which exception handler. Now, let's open our global exception handler. Remove the assignable types attribute in the @controller advice annotation and use the annotations attribute. And set its value to global exception handler annotation.class. Next, let's open our global exception handler 1. Replace assignable types attribute in the @controller advice with the annotations attribute and set its value to global exception handler annotation 1.class. Next, let's open our demo controller class. Since we want this controller to use global exception handler 1, so let's add the global exception handler annotation 1 at the class level. Add the global exception handler annotation at employee controller class. Now that everything is set up, let's start the application. Application is up and running. Now, let's switch over to Postman. First, let's hit the employee controller API again. Look at the response. We got status code, message, and timestamp just as expected. This confirms that our employee controller is correctly using the global exception handler with the expected response format. Now, let's test the demo controller API. Look at the response. We got code, message, and timestamp just as expected. This confirms that our demo controller is correctly using Global Exception Handler 1 with the expected response format. Everything is working perfectly. To sum up, we successfully set up multiple global exception handlers and used annotations to ensure our controllers use the appropriate handler. This allows us to have different response formats for different controllers, making our error handling precise and efficient. Thank you for joining me in this session. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.